Welcome to the presentation of the MNB's second TCFD report. My name is András Straubinger. I am the head of the Risk Management Department. With my colleague, Tima Karácsony, we will guide you through the report and explain the most important findings. We live in a period of defining changes with greater impact than ever before. One of the clearest manifestations of this is the change in environmental and climatic conditions and its consequences on ecological, social and economic processes. We still have the chance to avoid its most dramatic consequences, but we have no time to waste. Actions need to be taken in the short term to prevent the long-term negative effects of climate change. We must act simultaneously and in a coordinated way on a number of fronts to achieve Paris temperature goals. Active engagement is crucial in the whole process to create an optimal resource allocation necessary for the transition. It is now clear that everyone, including central banks, has a role to play in tackling the climate crisis. The financial system has a key role to play in this fight. The MNB's statutory objectives include, both directly and indirectly, promoting environmental sustainability and addressing the risks caused by climate change, as global warming has negative effects on price stability and the stability of the financial system. While the primary mandate of the central bank provides opportunities to address climate change, since mid-2021, the Green Mandate has further strengthened this by making the promotion of environmental sustainability an explicit objective without compromising the primary mandate. Transparency, data and measurement, the cornerstones of the central bank's environmental policies. Bearing these in mind, the MNB was among the first central banks to publish information on the climate exposure of its assets, operations and disclose related policies. The climate report, disclosed in April 2023, is the second report of the central bank this kind and is still unique in the CEE region, providing a good example for market participants. Since climate-related financial disclosure is a relatively young and evolving field, there is no uniform methodology for the preparation of the report. The MNB is following the TCFD recommendations, as well as international best practice in the report. The central bank aims to provide the broadest possible coverage of financial assets and analyze the transition as well as physical risk exposure of the portfolios with different metrics. The continuous enhancement of metrics used and the transparency of methodology is of key importance in climate risk reporting. The MNB, as a financial supervisory authority, seeks to set a good example by publishing this report annually and considers it a good practice for domestic credit institutions to publish similar reports. The active engagement of the private sector is essential in achieving sustainability. In addition to providing a good example for market participants, the MNB's analysis of its own activities is also essential to understand the related climate risks and to support better decision-making. In 2015, the G20 Financial Stability Board established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, to provide recommendations on climate-related disclosure reports. This facilitates more informed investment, lending and insurance decisions and allows market participants to better understand the concentration of GHG-intensive assets in the financial sector and the exposure of the financial system to climate-related and environmental risks. Transparency contributes to the more effective incorporation of these risks into strategic decision-making, thereby supporting capital flows towards sustainable investments. Although the MNB is not a listed company, it wishes to set an example by making disclosures in line with the TCFD recommendations. The TCFD's recommendations on climate-related financial disclosures are structured around 4 areas: internal governance, strategy, risk management, and matrices and targets. The most important role in the report is devoted to metrics, in particular the quantification of GHG emissions. The TCFD recommendations also contribute indirectly to improve internal governance, strategy development, and risk management in this area. The MNB's climate-related financial report, published in 2022, was one of the first of its kind among central banks. Recently, besides the Bank of England and the Banque de France, other central banks have also published sustainability and climate risk reports. In addition to the TCFD recommendations, Binding climate change standards, regulations that are coming into force gradually also improve environmental transparency and comparability, like SFDR or CSRD. Since climate-related financial reporting is a relatively new field, there is flexibility in the content of the report, and there is also room for gradual further development. The MNB's decision-making bodies are the Monetary Council, the Financial Stability Council, and the Executive Board. The MNB's decision-making bodies and the executives are regularly informed about the impact exerted by climate change and other environmental risks on the financial system, as well as the MNB's operations, and they support environmental sustainability through their decisions. The MNB's strategy for environmental sustainability has been established in line with its mandates, laid down in the MNB Act, and its organizational structure. In July 2021, the document Sustainability and Central Bank Policy, Green Aspects in the MNB's Monetary Policy Toolkit was published, which sets out the strategic orientation for mainstreaming long-term environmental sustainability considerations through central bank instruments. In the Green Monetary Policy Toolkit strategy, the central bank identifies a number of climate-related risks that may have an impact on price stability. Without compromising its primary objective, the MNB develops its monetary policy toolkit in harmony with long-term environmental sustainability considerations. The Central Bank of Hungary has taken a number of steps to integrate environmental considerations into its operational framework, in line with its responsibilities under the MNB Act. In 2019, the MNB was among the first central banks to decide to construct a portfolio of dedicated green bonds within its foreign exchange reserves. The central bank purchased green mortgage bonds and corporate bonds, granted green loans before suspending the relevant programs in 2022. The implementation of climate-related aspects in the collateral management framework or in the macroprudential policies needs also to be mentioned in this regard. Environmental risk management is highlighted in the supervisory strategy. The MNB launched the Green Program in January 2019, an initiative that is still unique in the Central and Eastern European region. The Green Program sets out the relationship of the supervisory strategy to sustainability objectives, supporting the stability of the financial system through the identification, measurement and management of climate-related and environmental risks. Greening its own operations is also a priority for the central bank, which has set a target of an 80% reduction in direct carbon emissions by 2025 compared to the 2019 level. In order to reduce the environmental footprint of the MNB's operations, the bank operates an environmental management system that operates on a 3-year cycle, with the current cycle covering the period 2020-2022. Medium-term strategic objectives are set for each cycle, and the implementation of these objectives is supported by the environmental program. For environmental risks, dual materiality is a defining criterion which covers environmental materiality in addition to financial materiality. In other words, the consequences of climate change can affect an institution, and the institution can also have an impact on the environment through its activities and investments. Given the specific characteristics of climate-related risk, traditional risk management frameworks cannot be applied with adequate accuracy, and it is therefore essential to adjust them and introduce new methodologies. These risks are nonlinear, irreversible, and characterized by a factor distribution. Many of the impacts of climate change will materialize and be reflected in financial risks over longer time horizons, but they can only be mitigated by actions taken today. Since models based on historical data are not sufficient, forward-looking estimates are also required, for example, scenario analysis. The details of how climate-related risks and environmental risks will materialize are unknown. It can be stated with absolute certainty that the materialization of some combination of the transition and physical risk is inevitable. In line with the diverse task of MNB, the risk management framework of the central bank is composed of different parts. Quantifying and managing climate risk is a dynamically developing field. Taking into account the special characteristics of climate risk, environmental sustainability is increasingly reflected in the central bank's operational areas and programs, such as the asset purchase programs, central bank lending, collateral management, and foreign exchange reserve management. Climate change has an indirect impact on financial supervision via the financial system and the real economy. And now I will hand over to my colleague.
Welcome everyone. The second part of the presentation is mainly focusing on the calculated metrics. But before we dive into the numbers, there are some methodological considerations important to note. TCFD divided climate-related risks into two major categories, transition and physical risks. The MNB used this division to analyze the climate risk exposure of its financial asset portfolios. Transition risks are associated with the transition to a carbon-neutral and climate-resilient economy. These risks arise from changes in the economic structure, including changes in policy or technology, or rapid shifts in consumer attitudes, which can all cause a sudden revaluation in the price of financial instruments. To measure the transition risk of the portfolios, the MNB primarily used the weighted average carbon intensity, which is the proposed metric for climate risk analysis of financial asset portfolios based on the TCFD recommendations. In addition to the weighted average carbon intensity, the proportion of carbon-intensive assets, the so-called brown share, in corporate portfolios, the energy mix of sovereign portfolios, as well as forward-looking metrics from Climate Action Tracker have been used. Physical risks represent the other main risk category, which arise from the physical effects of climate change. These include changes in the long-term climate and an increase in the severity and frequency of extreme weather events. Physical risks might be acute and chronic, depending on whether they are event-driven or longer-term physical risk events. Physical risks involve not only the risk of losses due to the destruction of physical assets and infrastructure themselves, but also the breakdown of value chains, the loss of biodiversity, and the negative impacts on human health and well-being. These might obviously have an impact on the productivity of companies or the value of physical and financial assets, which may also affect financial stability. To analyze physical risks in the portfolio, the MNB used data and models from Moody's Analytics. The MNB aims to provide information on the widest possible range of its instruments and related climate risk considerations. The analysis of the climate impacts of financial portfolios was based on preliminary balance sheet data at the end of 2022 and the latest available greenhouse gas emissions and corresponding GDP data. The MNB has quantified more than one metric for each asset category to gain a broader understanding of the risks and opportunities of climate change. The methodology applied in the report is in line with the TCFD recommendations and international best practice as well. In the short term, the MNB will produce a report which is representative of its total assets but not exhaustive, mainly due to data availability constraints. In comparison to other international central bank climate disclosures, the MNB provides information on a very broad set of portfolios. In the case of the foreign exchange reserves, the climate risk of these sovereign exposures was analyzed. The weighted average carbon intensity metric for the sovereign exposure of the reserve portfolios was 318 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per million euro of GDP. It is slightly higher than was the value in last year and that of the reference portfolio. The increase in the metric was caused by changes in several factors, but the most significant impacts stem from changes and reallocations in the reserve structure. The MNB did not use the portfolio management benchmarks as a reference for the calculation of the carbon intensity metric, as they were designed without taking into account climate risk considerations. Instead, a neutral external benchmark, the currency composition of the IMF's official foreign exchange reserves, was used. As a forward-looking assessment, the MNB analyzed Climate Action Tracker scenarios and the energy mix of its sovereign exposures. The Climate Action Tracker, which is one of the best-known climate change monitoring organizations, monitors government actions and measures them against the globally agreed Paris Agreement target. Data from the organization shows that the majority of countries in the reference portfolio do not meet the requirements of the Paris Climate Agreement. Overall, the sovereign exposure in the MNB's foreign exchange reserves is in the range of almost sufficient and insufficient climate scenarios. As regards energy composition, the current energy mix of the foreign exchange reserve countries differs substantially from the 2025 mix assumed as necessary in the International Energy Agency sustainability scenario. As with the composition of the reference portfolio, the sovereign exposure of the foreign exchange reserves consists primarily of issues from developed economies. Thus, the physical riskiness of the portfolio is determined by data from the world's leading economies. The portfolio has a relatively risky ranking in the universe based on its overall risk score. The portfolio scores highest in the sea level rise and flood risk categories. In the context of the foreign exchange reserves, it needs to be highlighted that the MNB built up a dedicated green bond portfolio, thereby integrating environmental sustainability into its reserve management. When it comes to the government securities purchase program, the weighted average carbon intensity metric of the government securities portfolio was 448 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per million euro of GDP, which is lower than the regional average and the previous year's value. Hungary's exposure to physical risk is considered as relatively low, with an overall risk score in the lower third of the universe covered by the data provider. Among the different risk categories, Hungary is most exposed to the risk of heat stress, while it is in the less risky half of the universe in the other risk categories. The weighted average carbon intensity of the corporate exposures, namely the bond funding for growth scheme and funding for growth scheme portfolios, are higher than that of the Hungarian corporate sector and the average corporate carbon intensity of the regional countries. There was a slight increase in the figure compared to the previous year, primarily driven by the sector composition of the securities purchased in 2022 in the BGS portfolio, or by the changing sector composition due to drawdowns and repayments in the FGS portfolio. The average carbon intensity metric of the corporate portfolio ranged between 584 and 718 tons of CO2 equivalents per million euro of value added. The brown share of the corporate exposures also increased, but is still relatively low. The corporate portfolios exhibit relatively low risk across most of the physical risk categories. In the corporate exposure, the headquarters of the issuing companies are highly concentrated geographically, with the majority located in Budapest, which also has a strong impact on the physical risk assessment of the exposure. Among the physical risks in the portfolio, heat stress, wildfires and floods are the most significant, while based on the other risk metrics, the exposure is only moderately or not at all risky. It should be noted that the methodology of the data provider has changed since the previous report was published, resulting in an increase in the scores for certain locations in the flood risk category. The Central Bank of Hungary has been continuously monitoring its operational carbon footprint for 10 years and is striving to reduce it. The volume of the carbon footprint has decreased by 30% in the last 3 years. The MNB undertook in its medium-term environmental strategy to reduce its operational carbon footprint by 30% by the end of 2022 based on 2019, and this commitment was already achieved at the end of 2021. The goal is to reduce the carbon footprint by 80% by 2025, which the MNB plans to achieve mainly through the installation of photovoltaic systems and 100% renewable energy for the electricity supply of its buildings. The carbon footprint of the MNB's operational activities cannot be completely reduced. To compensate for the remaining emissions, the MNB will finance habitat restoration projects that can absorb the entirety of its carbon footprint in the coming years. An example of nature-based programs implemented with the help of WWF Hungary is the 27-hectare afforestation project near the municipality of Kest in the Körös-Maros National Park. Today, the transport of cash can be deemed mainly responsible for the carbon footprint of the cash supply chain. However, since the early 2010s, domestic credit institutions have increasingly adopted customer-operated banknote deposit and recycling machines, which allow banknotes to be processed locally without the need for transport, thus reducing the associated environmental impact. Furthermore, digitalization is also beneficial in reducing emissions. In 2023, the central bank started to prepare its environmental sustainability recommendations on the business model, strategy, operations, and risk management of money processing companies. Following the publication of the recommendation, the MNB will continuously monitor compliance with the requirements set out in the recommendation. Climate change is one of the key challenges of our century. The first step to tackle environmental risk is transparency and the availability of high-quality data. To support this process and to incentivize market participants, the MNB prepared and published its second climate-related financial disclosure. We strongly believe that with swift and coordinated moves, environmental sustainability can be achieved. Thank you for your attention.